segregation did not return with sirens. It returned with paperwork. This week, the U.S. Justice Department helped end a school desegregation agreement in Louisiana, a decree that had existed since 1967, not because segregation was proven to be gone, not because the danger had passed, but because officials said there had been no disputes. That sentence should stop you cold, because silence is not justice, and the absence of conflict is not proof of equality. Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg warned us about this exact moment. She said, removing protections because nothing bad happened is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm, because you are not getting wet. This decision was approved quietly, but its meaning is loud. It signals a shift in how power views history and how quickly safeguards can disappear. If you want to understand how moments like this reshape America, stay with me. Share this, because this story is not just about one school district. It is about what happens next. And to see that clearly, we need to define the problem itself. Let me define the issue clearly. This is not a legal technicality. It is not a bureaucratic cleanup. It is a decision about whether the federal government still sees segregation as a threat. The consent decree that was removed existed for one reason, because local schools were once found to be segregated long after segregation had already been ruled illegal. These decrees were not symbolic. They were guardrails. They existed to prevent old behavior from quietly returning. The argument used to remove them sounds reasonable on the surface. There were no recent disputes, no active lawsuits, no open conflict. But that logic reverses history. It treats equality as permanent and discrimination as something that only exists when people complain. That is not how systems work. And it is not how power fades. When oversight disappears, incentives change. When incentives change, behavior follows. This is not about the past. It is about whether prevention still matters. To understand why these guardrails were built in the first place, we have to go back to where this story began. To understand this moment, we have to go backward. Back to a time when segregation was not subtle. It was written into law, enforced by policy, protected by silence. In 1954, the Supreme Court ruled in Brown versus Board of Education that segregated schools were unconstitutional. The decision was clear. The resistance was stronger. A decade later, segregation was still happening, not in theory, in practice. That is why in 1967, the federal government intervened in DeSoto Parish. It did not do so lightly. It did so because schools were still separating students by race. Consent decrees emerged from that era. They were not punishments. They were mechanisms. They acknowledged a simple truth, that systems do not change because the law changes. They change because pressure remains. These decrees stayed in place for decades because history showed what happens when oversight disappears. Progress left alone does not automatically continue. It stalls, then it reverses, and eventually something breaks. That breaking point would come again. Then came the first rupture. Not in the streets, not on the news, but inside a courtroom. This week, a federal judge approved a joint request from Louisiana officials and the U.S. Justice Department. Together, they asked to dismiss a desegregation case that had been active since 1967. The parish was DeSoto. About 5,000 students, a small system, a big signal. State officials celebrated. They said the school system was finally back. They said there had been no disputes for 10 years. So the decree, they argued, was unnecessary. But that moment matters. Because the decree was not lifted after a trial, not after new evidence, not after proof that segregation was impossible to return. It was lifted because nothing had gone wrong. That is not resolution. That is amnesia. If this feels technical, don't scroll away. Moments like this rarely announce themselves. They normalize themselves, and once one barrier falls, others become easier to remove. What looks like closure is often just the beginning, because beneath this decision is a deeper mechanism at work. Here is the mechanism beneath the surface. Desegregation decrees were never about micromanaging schools. They were about deterrence. Their power came from presence, from the knowledge that someone was watching, that someone could intervene. When that presence disappears, the system does not stay neutral. It tilts. Local control sounds benign, even democratic. But history tells us something else. When federal oversight retreats, decisions shift quietly. Zoning lines harden, school boundaries change, resources drift, not by decree, by habit. No one has to announce segregation. It emerges through accumulation. The Justice Department did not argue that segregation is impossible now. It did not show that future discrimination cannot occur. It simply stepped away. That is the mechanism. Remove the guardrail, call it progress. But guardrails are not evidence of failure. They are evidence of memory. Once the system forgets why it was built this way, it begins to resemble what it once was. And that forgetting does not stop at one parish. It spreads because once enforcement becomes optional, equality becomes conditional. And that leads directly to the next rupture. Then came the second escalation. This time, it was no longer subtle. The DeSoto Parish decision was not isolated. It followed another move. Earlier, a different desegregation decree was ended in Plaquemines Parish. Same state, same logic. And before that, the administration removed language that banned federal contractors from operating segregated facilities. Taken alone, each action can be explained away. Together, they form a pattern. This is how systems change. Not with one dramatic reversal, but with repetition. Each rollback lowers the cost of the next one. Each success makes resistance harder. Each silence becomes permission. The Justice Department once enforced desegregation. Now it is actively helping dismantle it. There is no declaration that segregation is acceptable. There does not need to be. Power rarely announces its intentions. It reshapes incentives and lets behavior follow. This is the moment when history accelerates, because precedent is being written in real time. And while these decisions happen in courtrooms and legal filings, their consequences do not stay there. They travel outward into classrooms, into neighborhoods, into lives. That is where the real impact begins. Now let me bring this to you, because this is where policy becomes personal. If you are a parent, this affects where your child learns, who they sit next to, what resources their school receives. If you are a student, this shapes your future long before you can vote, long before you have a voice. Segregation today does not wear signs. It wears distance, underfunding, lower expectations. And when oversight disappears, you are told to trust the system, but systems do not feel consequences. People do. You feel it in crowded classrooms, in outdated textbooks, in opportunities that quietly vanish. No one tells you this is discrimination. You are simply told it is normal. That is how inequality survives, by becoming invisible. If this resonates with you, don't ignore it. Share this. Talk about it, because silence is not neutrality. Silence is surrender. And what is happening to one community today can happen to another tomorrow. Now step back with me, because this story does not stop at America's borders. Look beyond Louisiana, because when the United States retreats from equality, the world notices America has long presented itself as a model of pluralism. Imperfect, yes, but committed to progress. Desegregation was not just a domestic policy. It was a signal to allies, to rivals. To developing democracies watching closely, when enforcement weakens, credibility weakens with it, other governments draw lessons quickly. If equality can be treated as optional in America, why should it be non-negotiable elsewhere? This is how norms erode globally, not through speeches, through precedent. The rollback of desegregation fits into a wider pattern of retreat from multilateral values and shared moral leadership. And that creates space. Space for authoritarian narratives, space for ethnic nationalism, space for arguments that say diversity is a problem, not a strength. What happens in a Louisiana courtroom echoes far beyond its walls, because when the center fails to hold, the edges begin to fracture, and that leaves us facing a future that can break in more than one direction. So let me show you the paths ahead. From here, three futures emerge. The first is the optimistic one. Oversight ends, but vigilance replaces it. Communities stay engaged. Parents organize. Courts step in when needed. Equality survives not by mandate, but by effort. This path is possible, but it requires constant pressure. And pressure is exhausting. The second future is quieter. And more likely, decrees disappear, nothing dramatic happens, but small shifts accumulate. School lines subtly redraw, resources slowly concentrate. Segregation returns, not by law, but by outcome. By the time it is visible, it feels permanent. The third future is the darkest. Federal retreat becomes doctrine. Desegregation is rebranded as overreach. History is reframed as exaggeration. And equality becomes conditional, granted when convenient, withdrawn when costly. None of these futures arrive overnight. They arrive through choices, through neglect, through forgetting. The question is not which future is possible. It is which one we are already walking toward. So let me leave you with this. Desegregation was never just a policy. It was a promise that the country would remember what happens when equality is left to chance, when protection is treated as excess, when history is declared finished. The danger is not open segregation. The danger is forgetting why we built defenses against it. Because systems do not warn you before they slide backward. They normalize the slide. They call it efficiency. They call it local control. They call it progress. And one day you look around and realize the umbrella is gone, not because the storm ended, but because people stopped believing it could rain again. This story is not over. And it is not limited to one parish. It is about how democracies decay quietly, legally, incrementally. If this analysis made you pause, share it, talk about it, challenge the silence. Because the next rollback is already being prepared. And the next one after that, stay with me. This is not the last conversation we need to have.